Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Today I'm going to make some simple end grain cutting boards. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm making these boards from some off-cut maple and walnut that I had from previous projects. Most of the maple was already flat and straight, but the walnut was rough cut and needed to be straightened out on the joiner and the planer. I planed all the boards down to the thickness of my thinnest piece, which happened to be about 3/4 of an inch. Next I moved over to the table saw. I ripped all the boards that I had down to 1.5 inch strips. After all the strips are cut, I was able to lay out the maple and the walnut in a pattern that I thought would look good. Then I could head over to the bench to start gluing up the first strips. I had enough boards here to do 2 different layouts, or 2 different glue ups. Before clamping anything up, I'm just making sure that the pattern looks right. I'll spend some extra time here to make sure the glue up is nice and flat as I clamp it down. The trick to keeping it flat is to not apply too much clamping pressure and to add cauls if you need to. I'll apply the same techniques for the second group of boards. Once the glue's dried overnight, I'll use a paint scraper to scrape off all the excess glue. Now I can run the boards through the planer to finish flattening everything out. One of the glue ups was a little too wide to work with safely at the table saw, so here I'm just chopping it in half. I want the cutting boards to be roughly 2 inches thick, so I'm setting my table saw to cut 2-inch strips. Now I'll cut as many 2-inch sections as I can. Once I've cut everything at the table saw, I can start laying out for the final glue up. I'll flip all the strips so that the end grain's facing up and the pattern's the same on every board, and then I'll go back and flip every other strip. This will give me a basic checker pattern with the walnut boards. While I'm setting up for the final glue up of the 2 boards, I will take each strip and sand them down with a sanding block and some 220 grit paper. This is just to knock off any of the burrs or edges that might be too rough to glue up evenly. Now I can apply some glue, make sure my pattern's right, and clamp these guys down. And just like the first glue up, I want to make sure that I don't over clamp these boards and cause any kind of warping or bowing. And again, once the glue's dried, I'll scrape off all the remaining glue with a paint scraper. Once I have all the excess glue scraped off, I can use the newest addition to my shop, 1938 drum sander by Supermax. I've only had this tool for a couple of weeks, but so far it's working out pretty good. It's a lot easier to cut the end grain with the drum sander than it is to try to do it with a belt sander, and it's a lot safer than using a planer. I started by running the cutting board through the drum sander with 80 grit paper attached. I would have went with a 60 or 30 grit if I had it, but 80 was all I had on hand. I took multiple passes, taking very thin sands or cuts off of it. Then I changed out the paper for 180 grit and repeated the process, taking multiple thin passes at the cutting board. I'm really liking this drum sander, and I hope to do a full review on it here in a couple of weeks. Next, I'll move over to the table saw and use my crosscut sled to square up all 4 sides of the boards. Here I'm marking out the center of each cutting board on the ends. I'm going to route small handles into each side. I'll use a small cove bit and make multiple thin passes to try to avoid as much burning as possible. Next, I'll change out to a round over bit and round over all the edges of the boards. Now I'm ready to final sand the cutting boards. I'm going to set up with some 150 grit paper on a random orbital sander. The drum sander definitely flattens everything out and gets a good finish on it, but it still leaves quite a bit of scratch marks. So even though I ended with 180 grit paper on the drum sander, I'm going to have to start with 150 grit on the random orbital sander and then work my way up to 220 grit. I'll sand the coves for the handles and all the edges by hand to make sure I get rid of all the burn marks. And finally, the most satisfying part of the project, applying the finish. I put 2 coats of this butcher block finishing oil on each cutting board. I let the first coat dry overnight before applying the second. And that's it for these 2 cutting boards. These are a pretty simple project. It's a good way to use up your scraps, and I think every woodworker has to make these at some point. So I hope you liked the project. If you did, please hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks, guys.